The night Vivian Ashford walked into the bar where I worked, I thought she was just another rich woman who'd gotten lost on her way to somewhere better. She had that look, the kind that comes from never once having to ask the price of anything. Silk blouse, pearls that weren't trying to prove a point, eyes that scanned the room like she owned it, which, I'd later find out, she practically did. I wiped down the counter and told myself not to stare. I'd been telling myself a lot of things that year that I never actually managed to do. I was 31, 3 months behind on rent, and bartending at the Meridian on Manhattan's Upper West Side, a place expensive enough that the tips kept me alive, but intimate enough that regulars started to feel like family. I knew everyone's order before they sat down. I knew who was celebrating and who was drowning. I was good at reading people. Or at least I thought I was. Until Vivian sat at the end of the bar, alone, and ordered a glass of still water. Just water. In a place like that. Like a dare. She came back 4 nights in a row. Always alone. Always that same corner stool. And every night, she'd study me the way I studied everyone else. Quietly, carefully. Like she was solving something. It made my hands clumsy. I knocked over a shaker on the 3rd night. She didn't laugh. She just watched me clean it up. And there was something in her expression I couldn't name yet. On the 5th night, she didn't order water. She gestured slowly to the entire back shelf, 43 bottles of premium spirits lined up like soldiers, looked straight into my eyes, and said, with the most terrifyingly calm voice I had ever heard in my life, "If I drink all these drinks, will you marry me?" The whole bar went quiet. Or maybe that was just my blood, stopping inside my veins. I looked at her. She wasn't joking. And the answer that rose inside me wasn't a laugh, wasn't outrage, wasn't confusion. It was something far more dangerous than any of those things. And when I opened my mouth, what came out froze us both. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart beating a little faster, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single chapter. Drop a comment right now telling us, what city and country are you watching from? I read every single comment, every one of them. The first thing I noticed about her was that she didn't look at her phone. In a bar full of people performing their own loneliness into glowing screens, she just sat there, hands folded on the counter, back straight, eyes moving slowly around the room like she was cataloging everything. The pendant lights, the couple arguing in hushed tones near the window, the jazz quartet setting up in the corner, and eventually, inevitably, me. I was used to being looked at behind the bar. It's an occupational hazard. But the way Vivian Ashford looked at me that first night didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like recognition, which made no sense, because I had never seen her before in my life. "Still water," she said, when I finally walked over. No please, no smile, no menu. Just those 2 words, delivered like a quiet fact. I almost asked if she was sure. We were at one of the most well-stocked bars in Manhattan, the kind of place where the cocktail menu read like a short story collection. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the pearls. Maybe it was the way she said it, like she'd already considered and dismissed every other option in the world. I poured her water, set it down, and went back to my other customers. I told myself I'd forgotten about her before I reached the other end of the counter. That was a lie. She left exactly 40 minutes later. No food, no second glass, no conversation beyond that initial order. She left a $50 bill under the empty glass for a $4 water, put on a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and walked out without looking back. I stood there holding the 50 and felt, for reasons I couldn't immediately explain, like I'd just missed something important. My coworker Danny leaned over my shoulder and whistled low. "Who was that?" he asked. "No idea," I said. And I meant it. But I kept the 50 separate from the rest of my tips that night, like it was evidence of something. She came back the next evening. Same stool, same coat, same order. This time I didn't ask questions. I just set the water down before she could speak, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. More like the beginning of one that she decided against at the last second. She stayed 55 minutes, left another 50. I started to wonder if she was testing something, though I couldn't figure out what, or why someone who looked like her would need to test a bartender in a place like the Meridian. Rich people had their reasons. I'd learned not to ask. By the third night, Danny had nicknamed her the Water Woman and placed a bet with our colleague Priya that she was either a spy or going through a very quiet divorce. I didn't participate in the speculation, but I listened to it, and I noticed that I was listening a little too carefully. I noticed that I'd started watching the door around 9 o'clock, which was when she usually arrived. I noticed that the 43 minutes between her arrival and her departure felt different from the rest of the shift. Quieter somehow, even when the bar was loud. I knocked over a shaker reaching past her for a bottle of rye, and the crash of it against the counter made half the room flinch. She didn't. She just watched me gather the pieces with an expression that was almost gentle. On the fourth night, she asked me my name. Just that. "What's your name?" The way you'd ask someone the time, casual and direct, but with her eyes doing that focused, unblinking thing that made my pulse do something unprofessional. "Sloane," I said. She nodded slowly, like she was filing it somewhere careful. She didn't offer her own name. I didn't ask. The rules of whatever this was felt delicate, and I was beginning to understand, without fully understanding why, that I didn't want to break them. I looked her up that night. I'm not proud of it, but I did. Went home to my apartment in the Bronx, sat on my second-hand couch with a bowl of cereal I didn't really want, and typed "woman, Upper West Side, pearls, camel coat" into a search bar like that was going to get me anywhere. It didn't. I tried Meridian Bar Regular, which was even more useless. I put my phone face down and told myself I was being ridiculous. I was a bartender. She was a customer. The world was full of quietly beautiful women with complicated eyes and unexplained 50s, and none of them were my business. I believed that right up until the fifth night, when everything changed. She arrived at 8:47, earlier than usual, which I noticed immediately, and hated myself for noticing. She sat down, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. She looked at the back shelf. All of it, the single malts, the aged bourbons, the small batch gins, the bottles that took up the full length of the wall behind me, 43 in total, lit from below like an amber cathedral. She looked at them the way someone looks at a decision they've already made. Then she looked at me, and she said it. "If I drink all these drinks, will you marry me?" The bar didn't go quiet dramatically, the way it does in movies. People kept talking. The jazz quartet kept playing. Danny kept shaking something citrusy at the other end of the counter. But inside my chest, everything stopped. She was watching me with those steady, unreadable eyes, and I understood with absolute clarity that she was not joking. She was not drunk. She was not performing for anyone around her. She was asking me, Sloane Mercer, bartender, 31, 3 months behind on rent, a real question. And my mouth opened. And what came out of it was not a laugh, not a refusal, not the sensible, self-protective thing I had spent the last 3 years training myself to say in moments that frightened me. What came out was, "Okay, but you go one at a time, and I pick the order." The look on her face in that moment, I will never for the rest of my life forget it. For exactly 3 seconds, neither of us moved. The jazz quartet launched into something slow and brass-heavy, and the sound of it wrapped around the silence between us like it was trying to protect it. Vivian Ashford sat on that corner stool with her hands still folded on the counter, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as relieved, which made absolutely no sense, and which I would spend the next several weeks trying to understand. I had just agreed, in some loose and reckless interpretation of the word, to marry a stranger if she drank 43 shots of premium liquor. I was a sensible woman. I had a library card. I flossed. And yet... "Okay," she said. Just that. The same word I'd used, given back to me like a receipt. Then she straightened on the stool, unfolded her hands, and placed them flat on the counter with a kind of deliberate calm that made me think of someone stepping onto a diving board. "Where do we start?" I looked at her for a moment. Then I turned to the shelf. My eyes moved across the bottles the way they always did during a slow moment. Inventorying, assessing, reading the room through its liquor the way I read people through their orders. I reached up and brought down a small, unpretentious bottle from the second shelf. Amaro Montenegro. Bitter, complex, not what most people would choose first. I poured a modest measure into a clean glass and set it in front of her. "This one," I said. "It's bitter at the start. Gets softer as it goes." She looked at the glass. Then she looked at me. And I had the distinct and unsettling feeling that she understood I wasn't only talking about the drink. She picked up the glass with 2 hands, the way someone holds something they've never held before, and she drank it in one slow, steady pull. She set the glass down. Her eyes watered, just slightly, just for a second, and she breathed out through her nose in a thin, controlled stream. "Next," she said. Her voice was perfectly even, like she'd been preparing for this specific moment and was not going to let a little thing like 42 remaining drinks rattle her. Danny appeared at my elbow approximately 30 seconds later. "What is happening?" he said, in a tone that was less question and more quiet alarm. "Nothing," I told him. "Go run the West tables." He didn't move immediately. He looked at Vivian, then at the glass, then at me, and his expression cycled through confusion, concern, and finally a kind of reluctant awe. "Sloane," he said carefully. "That woman just... Danny." He went. I turned back to Vivian, who had watched this entire exchange with something that might have been amusement living in the corner of her mouth. "Friend of yours?" she asked. "Co-worker," I said. "He worries." "That's kind of him," she said, and she meant it. I could tell she meant it, which surprised me. I poured the second drink. Aperol, neat, lighter, a little sweeter, a palate rest of sorts. She took it without hesitation. The third was a dry vermouth. The fourth, a small pour of aged rum that smelled like vanilla and wood smoke. Each time she drank cleanly and set the glass down and said "next," with the composure of someone completing a task they had assigned themselves long before tonight. I started to slow my pour slightly, not out of strategy, but because I was watching her too closely to move at my normal pace. I was looking for the crack. The moment she'd laugh and say she was kidding, or pull back, or let the performance drop. It didn't come. Around the 7th drink, a smoky Islay scotch that makes grown men cough, she finally spoke between pours. "You didn't say no," she said. Not accusatory, observational. "No," I agreed, drying a glass I didn't need to dry. I didn't. Most people would have. I'm aware. She considered this. "Why didn't you?" I set the glass down and looked at her directly, which I'd been carefully avoiding for the last 20 minutes, because direct eye contact with Vivian Ashford felt like standing too close to something that could burn you. "I don't know yet," I said. It was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone in months. Something moved across her face, quick and private, like a light switched on briefly in a room you weren't supposed to see into. By the 10th drink, a small crowd had quietly gathered. Not dramatically. No one was pointing or making noise. But I noticed the couple near the window had stopped arguing. Priya had found reasons to restock bottles that didn't need restocking on our end of the bar. The jazz quartet had subtly shifted to face our direction, Vivienne either didn't notice or didn't care. She sat in the center of all that attention the way she seemed to sit in everything, completely, unhurriedly herself. At drink 13, a pour of chartreuse that turned her expression briefly to something close to suffering, she set the glass down and looked at her own hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You're already asking me to marry you," I said. "I think you've established a precedent for bold questions." That almost smile appeared again, fuller this time, and it did something to the room that the jazz quartet hadn't managed all evening. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "At this bar?" "In this life," she said quietly. "The one that feels like it's happening just slightly to the left of where you actually are." I didn't answer right away. I poured drink 14, a small, careful measure of pisco, and I thought about the question, and about the fact that a woman I had known for 5 evenings and approximately 400 words had just described something I had never found language for myself. "Long enough," I finally said, "to recognize someone else who's in the same place." She picked up the glass, drank it, set it down. "Next," she said. But her voice this time was different, softer, like something had been decided. We made it to drink 17 before the bar closed. She left her name on a card tucked under the last empty glass, Vivienne Ashford, and below it, in handwriting that was precise and slightly old-fashioned, "I'll be back tomorrow. We have 26 left." I Googled her properly this time. No half-hearted searches. No pretending I wasn't curious. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a cup of coffee I didn't need, and typed Vivienne Ashford into the search bar with the focused energy of someone who already suspected the results were going to complicate their life. They did. The first page alone was enough. Ashford Media Group. Estimated net worth, $4.3 billion. Daughter of the late Gerald Ashford, founder, and Margaret Ashford, current chairwoman, a woman whose photograph suggested she had never once in her 70 years made a decision she regretted. Vivienne was listed as Chief Creative Officer, which according to 3 separate profiles meant she was the most powerful person in the company that no one talked about, because her mother consumed all the available oxygen in any room that contained them both. I read until my coffee went cold. Then I read a little more. There were photographs. Vivienne at galas, Vivienne at gallery openings, Vivienne at the kind of charity events that cost more to attend than I made in a year. In every single one she wore the same expression she wore on that corner stool, composed, present, and somehow fundamentally elsewhere. There were no photographs of her with anyone who looked like a partner. There were 2 years' worth of gossip column speculation about a relationship with a French architect named Celeste, which had apparently ended quietly and without public statement, the way Vivienne seemed to do everything. There was a profile in the Times from 3 years ago in which she said, when asked about her personal life, "I find that people are most interesting before they decide what you are." The journalist had called it enigmatic. I called it the loneliest thing I'd ever read. I put my phone face down at 2:47 and stared at my ceiling. My apartment was the kind of small that stopped feeling small only when you'd lived in it long enough to stop seeing it clearly. A studio in the Bronx with a window that looked onto a fire escape, and beyond that, the specific nighttime gray of a city that never fully darkened. I'd lived there 4 years. I'd painted the kitchen wall a deep green the first winter because I needed one thing in the space that felt intentional. Other than that, the apartment looked like someone who was always planning to stay temporarily, which, I realized at 2:48 in the morning, might have been exactly what I'd been doing. Staying temporarily. In my own life. The next evening I arrived at work 40 minutes early, which I told myself was about prep, and told no one else anything, because there was nothing to tell. I restocked the back shelf methodically, which it did not need, and I thought about the order of the remaining 26 drinks with a focus that was professionally embarrassing. Danny arrived at 6 and watched me rearrange bottles I had already arranged, and said nothing for a full 3 minutes, which was a personal record for him. Then, "She's coming back, isn't she?" It wasn't a question. She said she would, I said. Sloane. Danny. She's a billionaire. I'm aware. You Googled her. Everybody Googled her. Priya literally showed me a Forbes article during her break last night. He leaned against the counter. Are you okay? The question landed differently than I expected, not with judgment, but with the specific gentleness of someone who knew me well enough to ask the right thing at the wrong time. I don't know, I said honestly. He nodded, like that was the correct answer, and went to set up the West tables without another word. That was why I'd worked with Danny for 3 years, and planned to keep doing so. She arrived at 8:30. Same coat, different blouse, ivory this time, with a small collar that made her look somehow both more formal and more approachable. She sat down on the corner stool and looked at the shelf, and I watched her eyes move across the remaining bottles with an expression I was beginning to learn. She was counting, confirming, making sure the thing she'd committed to was still there waiting for her. I set a glass of still water in front of her first, without being asked. She looked at it, then at me, and this time the almost smile became an actual one. Brief, real, slightly unguarded in a way that made my hands need something to do. You looked me up, she said. Not a question either, apparently. I considered denying it for approximately 1 second. Yes, I said. And your mother looks like someone who's never lost an argument. A short, genuine laugh escaped her, the kind that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised me. Sharp and unpolished, and completely unlike the woman in the Forbes photographs. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to her lips, as if to contain it, but it was already out. That, she said, is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in years. I poured drink 18. We picked up exactly where we had left off, which felt significant in a way I wasn't ready to examine. The evening moved differently from the ones before, slower, more deliberate, like we'd silently agreed to stop pretending this was something other than what it was. Between drinks 19 and 20, she told me she hadn't been in a relationship in 3 years. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, looking at the counter rather than at me, and I understood she wasn't asking for sympathy. She was offering information, choosing to be known, carefully, in increments. Why are you telling me that? I asked. She considered the question seriously. Because you read about Celeste, she said. And I'd rather you hear the real version than the one that makes a better story. The real version, as she told it in the spaces between drinks 20 and 23, was quieter and sadder and more human than anything the gossip columns had suggested. A relationship that had been genuine, but had slowly collapsed under the weight of 2 people who loved each other, but had never learned to need each other without apology. She wanted me to be softer, Vivian said, turning her glass slowly on the counter. I wanted to be. I just didn't know how to start. I thought about that for a long moment. What made you think drinking 43 shots with a bartender was a good place to start? She looked at me then, directly, steadily, in that way she had that made the room feel smaller and warmer. I've been watching you work for 5 nights, she said. You know exactly what everyone needs before they ask. You don't perform kindness, you just do it. And when you knocked over that shaker on the 3rd night, you apologized to the bottles. I opened my mouth, closed it. I thought the scotch deserved it, I said finally. It was a very good scotch. She smiled. Drink 24. We reached drink 30 before midnight, 13 remaining. She was, against all reasonable expectation, still completely coherent. Her speech clear, her posture straight, her eyes as focused as ever. I was beginning to suspect that Vivian Ashford operated on a different biological frequency than the rest of us, one in which sheer force of will could negotiate terms with your own bloodstream. Or she had eaten an extraordinarily strategic dinner. I asked. A very large meal, she confirmed, without a trace of apology. Planned in advance. You planned this. I plan everything, she said. Then, quieter. Except you. You were not in the plan. I held on to that sentence for the rest of the night like it was something I'd found on the sidewalk, and wasn't sure I was allowed to keep. When she left, she didn't leave a card this time. She left her number, written on a bar napkin in that precise, old-fashioned hand. Below it, drink 31 tomorrow, unless you've come to your senses. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. And for the first time in 3 years, I was glad. She texted at 11 the next morning. Not a greeting, not small talk, just, "Are you free before your shift?" I was standing in my kitchen in yesterday's socks eating toast over the sink, which is the kind of detail you don't mention to billionaires. So I put the toast down, looked at my phone for a moment and typed back. Depends on what for. 3 seconds later, coffee. There's a place on West 83rd that doesn't try too hard. I think you'd like it. I looked around my apartment, the green kitchen wall, the second-hand couch, the stack of library books on the floor next to my bed that I kept meaning to return. Then I typed, "What time?" and told myself that was a completely reasonable thing to do. I believed that for about 4 minutes before the anxiety arrived, right on schedule, like a coworker I hadn't hired but couldn't fire. The coffee shop was called Groundwork, and she was right. It didn't try too hard. Exposed brick, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu with honest prices, and no descriptions that used the word artisanal. Vivienne was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table. Of course it was a corner table, with 2 cups in front of her, and her coat folded over the back of her chair. Without the bar between us, she looked different. Not smaller exactly, but more present, more three-dimensional. Like I'd been looking at a photograph of her for 5 nights, and was now meeting the actual person. She stood briefly when I approached, which was such an old-fashioned gesture that it momentarily disarmed every defense mechanism I owned. "You look different," she said when I sat down. "Outside context," I said. "You too." She considered this. "Better or worse?" "Different," I repeated, and she accepted that with a small nod. The coffee was good. A simple pour-over, no theater. We sat with it for a moment the way 2 people do when they've spoken honestly about real things and are now figuring out how to do it again in daylight. It was harder in daylight. The bar had its own grammar, its own rules of intimacy that the city in the morning didn't provide. Here, there were no 43 drinks to structure the conversation. There was just us, which was either everything or terrifying, probably both. "I want to tell you why I came to the bar," she said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "The first night." I waited. Outside, a delivery truck was doing something loud and prolonged to the street, and a dog was expressing its feelings about this, and the city continued its complete indifference to whatever was happening at our corner table. "My therapist suggested it," Vivienne said. "She said I needed to go somewhere I wasn't known, somewhere no one would treat me like a Ashford. She said to go regularly, order something small, and practice just being in a room without managing it." She paused. I ordered water because I was nervous, and it was the only thing I could think of that required no decisions. I sat with that for a moment. Vivienne Ashford, CFO of a $4 billion media empire, woman who could silence a room by entering it, had walked into my bar nervous, ordered water to avoid making a decision, and come back 4 more times because her therapist told her to practice existing without armor. I didn't say any of this out loud. I said, "That's a very expensive therapy homework assignment." She laughed, that same short, unpolished laugh from the night before, the one that seemed to escape rather than be offered. "She's a very expensive therapist," she said. "Worth every dollar, apparently. I didn't expect to find—" She stopped, looked at her cup. "You," she finished quietly. Like the word had weight she wasn't sure she wanted to put down in front of me yet. I turned my cup slowly on the table. There was a conversation I needed to have, and I'd been building toward it since 2 a.m, and the Forbes article and the photograph of Margaret Ashford looking like a woman who categorized people for sport. "I need to say something," I said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She straightened slightly. "All right." "I'm a bartender," I said. "I live in a studio apartment in the Bronx. I have approximately $900 in savings, a library card, and a car I only drive to visit my mother in Queens, because parking in this city is a form of psychological warfare. I am not... I searched for the right word. I am not someone who fits into your life, the public version of it anyway. And I think we should both be honest about what that means before this goes any further." She listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that meant she was taking the thing seriously instead of deflecting it. "You're right," she said finally. "It's complicated. My mother is..." A brief pause that contained, I suspected, several years of a very specific kind of grief. "Formidable. The board has opinions about my personal life that they have no business having. There will be people who look at you and see a liability." She met my eyes. "I want you to know that I understand all of that, and I want you to know that I'm telling you anyway, which is not something I do." We stayed at that corner table for 2 hours. We talked about her father, who had died 4 years ago and left a silence in the company that her mother had filled with control and Vivian had filled with work. We talked about my last relationship, a woman named Petra, a landscape architect, kind and brilliant, who had eventually told me that loving me felt like loving someone who was always standing just outside the door of themselves. I hadn't argued with her. I'd known she was right. She wasn't wrong, I told Vivian. "I know," Vivian said. "Neither was Celeste, about me." We looked at each other across the small table with our empty cups, and the specific understanding of two people who have been told true things about themselves by people who love them and have spent years since deciding what to do with those true things. Outside, the city moved at its usual relentless pace. Taxis, strollers, someone on a bicycle narrating their grievances to no one. Vivian put on her coat, and I pulled on my jacket, and we stood on the sidewalk on West 83rd Street in the thin April sunlight. And there was a moment, brief, suspended, full of something neither of us named, where I thought she might reach for my hand. She didn't. She looked at me instead and said, "Drink 31 tonight?" "Drink 31 tonight," I confirmed. She nodded once, turned, and walked uptown. I watched her go for exactly as long as I was allowed to, without it meaning something. Then I walked to the subway, went home to the Bronx, stood in my green kitchen, and ate the cold toast I had abandoned that morning. It tasted, inexplicably, like something was beginning. That evening before her shift, Priya pulled me aside near the stockroom and said, "Sloane, that woman, I looked her up." "I know," I said. Everyone looked her up. Her mother gave an interview last year where she said Vivian's personal choices were and I'm quoting, "ongoing area of concern for the family's public standing." I took that in. Set it on the shelf next to everything else. "Okay," I said. "Okay, I repeated, and I went to open the bar. There is a particular kind of nervousness that doesn't announce itself clearly. It doesn't make your hands shake or your voice waver. It just settles somewhere behind your sternum and makes everything feel slightly more significant than usual, like the volume of the world has been turned up 2 notches without anyone touching the dial. That was how I felt the entire shift before Vivian arrived. I moved through the motions of the evening, mixing, pouring, listening, remembering that the man at table 4 always wanted his old-fashioned with a large ice cube and no cherry, And underneath all of it, that quiet, persistent hum. 13 drinks remaining. Whatever this was, it was almost finished. Or it was about to become something else entirely. I didn't know which possibility frightened me more. She arrived at 8. Not 8:30, not 8:47. 8 o'clock exactly, which felt deliberate in the way that everything Vivian did felt deliberate without being performative. She was wearing something different tonight. A dark navy dress under the camel coat, simpler than her usual, and her hair was down for the first time. It changed her face in a way I wasn't prepared for, made her look reachable somehow, less like a portrait, and more like a person who had made a specific decision about who she wanted to be tonight and dressed accordingly. I set the water glass down. She shook her head. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight we finish." I looked at her for a moment. Then I reached for drink 31. Danny had cleared a subtle perimeter around the corner of the bar without being asked, redistributing customers, keeping the adjacent stools unoccupied with the smooth efficiency of someone running a very low-key security operation. I caught his eye once, and he gave me a small, serious nod that meant approximately 15 things simultaneously, all of them kind. Priya had told the jazz quartet, apparently, because they shifted into something quieter and more atmospheric around 8:15. The kind of music that understands it's not the main event and plays accordingly. The Meridian had, without any formal announcement, decided to take this seriously. I found, to my surprise, that I was grateful. Drink 31 was a fine Calvados, apple brandy from Normandy, aged 12 years, with a warmth that arrived slowly and stayed. I poured it carefully and watched her drink it with the same focused composure she'd brought to everyone before it. And I thought about what she'd told me that morning, about her therapist, about practicing being in a room without managing it. She was managing this. I could see the effort of it, subtle and continuous, the way she kept her breathing even and her posture steady. But underneath the management there was something else, something that was not composed at all, and it was getting closer to the surface with every drink. I could see it the way I could see weather coming, not yet arrived, but inevitable. By drink 34, she had stopped saying "next" between pours. Instead, she would look at me, and I would look back, and something would pass between us in that look that was doing more communicating than either of us was doing out loud. 35 was a peated whiskey that made her close her eyes for a full 5 seconds. 36 was a delicate plum eau de vie that she held in her mouth briefly before swallowing, and when she opened her eyes, she said unprompted, "My father used to drink something like this, on Sunday evenings. He'd sit in his study, and I'd sit on the floor, and he'd read out loud to me even when I was too old for it." She paused. He was the only person in that family who ever made me feel like I was enough exactly as I was. I didn't say anything. I just poured drink 37 and let the silence hold what it needed to hold. 38, 39, 40. The bar was quieter now. It was past 11, the late crowd thinning, the jazz quartet wrapping their last set. Vivian's cheeks had taken on a faint warmth and her eyes were slightly brighter than usual. But her words remained precise, her hands steady. I was genuinely convinced, part metabolic anomaly and part sheer force of character. Between 39 and 40, she looked at her own reflection in the mirrored back of the shelf, briefly, almost accidentally, and then looked away with an expression that was so naked and unguarded that I felt I'd seen something I was meant to see and needed to honor carefully. "Are you all right?" I asked quietly. "I'm terrified," she said, with the same tone she might use to report the weather. But yes. 41 was a rum agricole that smelled like sugarcane and rain. 42 was a small, precise pour of aged gin that tasted like juniper and something almost floral. I set them both down and watched her take them with the steadiness of someone walking a path they'd chosen fully, and I felt something in my chest that I had been carefully not naming for 5 days begin to refuse that careful treatment. It had a name. It had had a name probably since the third night, when I'd knocked over a shaker, and she'd watched me clean it up with that almost gentle expression. I just hadn't been ready to say it, even internally, even alone. I was getting closer to ready. The 43rd drink would either help or destroy that process entirely. I reached for the last bottle. I'd known since the first night which drink I was saving for the end. I'd known it the way I knew things behind the bar, instinctively, and without having to think too hard about the reasons. It was a small batch bourbon from Kentucky, 11 years old, made by a distillery that had been family-run for 4 generations, and that described their process on the label in language that was almost embarrassingly sincere. It tasted like wood and caramel, and something that felt, if you were in the right frame of mind, like being forgiven for something you'd been carrying too long. I poured it slowly, set it in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. 43, I said. She picked up the glass. She didn't drink it immediately. She held it, the way she'd held that first Amaro 5 nights ago, with both hands, like it deserved that consideration. The bar was almost empty now. The city outside pressed its familiar gray and gold glow against the windows. Danny was somewhere in the back, giving us something I hadn't asked for and would thank him for later. Vivian looked at the bourbon, then at me, then at the bourbon again. And then she said very quietly, as if she was saying it for the first time and the last time simultaneously, "I wasn't joking when I asked you." "I know," I said. "Were you joking?" she asked. "When you said, okay." I thought about my green kitchen wall and the cold toast, and the way the morning had tasted like something beginning. "No," I said. "I wasn't joking either." She drank the 43rd drink. She set the glass down with a steadiness that cost her something. I could see exactly what it cost her. And then she looked at me across the bar, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the bourbon, and she said, "So." And I said, "So." And neither of us said anything else for a long moment, because some things, once they become real, need a second to be breathed into carefully before they can be spoken. I locked up the bar at midnight. Danny left first, squeezing my shoulder once on his way out in a gesture that contained an entire conversation we didn't need to have out loud. Priya followed, giving me a look that was equal parts encouragement and warning, and something that might have been envy, in the best possible sense. The jazz quartet had packed up an hour earlier. The last customers filtered out by 11:40, leaving the Meridian in that specific post-closing quiet that I usually loved. The hum of the refrigeration units, the amber glow of the undershelf lighting, the city muffled but present beyond the glass. Tonight the quiet felt different, charged, like a room after lightning has passed through it, and the air hasn't settled back into its normal arrangement. Vivian was still on her stool. She hadn't moved while I closed out the register, wiped down the counters, stacked the last of the glasses. She watched me work with the focused attention she brought to everything, and I let myself be watched, which was not something I did easily. I was a person who preferred to be the one watching. Giving myself over to being seen, even just in the small act of doing my job in an empty bar, required something from me. I gave it anyway. Somewhere between the register and the last bar stool I made that decision. To stop being the person who stands just outside the door of themselves. To try, at least. To try starting here, tonight. In this particular amber light with this particular woman and her 43 empty glasses lined up along the bar like a record of something real. "Walk with me," she said when I put on my jacket. Not a question, exactly. More like an offering, the kind you leave out carefully for someone and then step back from, giving them room to take it or leave it without consequence. I zipped my jacket. "Where?" "Anywhere," she said. I'm not ready for this to be over yet." There it was, said plainly. In that direct way, she had that I was beginning to understand was not coldness or arrogance, but its precise opposite. A person who had decided that honesty was less dangerous than ambiguity, even when honesty was frightening. Especially then. I held the door open. She walked through it, and we stepped out together into the April night. Manhattan at midnight in early spring has a particular quality. The cold still in the air, but softer than it was. The streets thinned of their daytime urgency, the city operating at something closer to a human pace. We walked west toward Riverside Park without discussing it, which felt right. The park at this hour was quiet in the way that New York is never fully quiet. Distant traffic, a siren blocks away, the river invisible in the dark, but present in the smell of the air. We walked side by side with a distance between us that kept narrowing and then correcting itself, like we were negotiating something non-verbally that neither of us was ready to finalize. Our breath made small clouds in the cold. Her heels were impractical for park paths, and she walked in them anyway, without complaint, without slowing down. "Tell me something true," she said, after we'd walked for a few minutes in comfortable silence. It was the kind of request that could have felt performative coming from someone else. From Vivian, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. A woman who had spent the last 5 nights systematically dismantling the distance between herself and another person, now simply asking for the next true thing. I thought about it honestly. "I haven't let anyone close in 3 years," I said. "Not really. I've been present enough that people don't notice, but not actually there. It's a skill I developed accidentally and kept because it felt safe." I paused. It stopped feeling safe about 4 days ago. She was quiet for a moment. "What happened 4 days ago?" "You ordered something other than water," I said. She stopped walking. I stopped too, and we stood on the path in the dark with the river somewhere beyond the tree line, and the city behind us doing its eternal, indifferent thing. She turned to face me, and in the low light she looked undone, slightly. Not devastated, not fragile, but opened. Like something that had been held at careful tension for a very long time, had finally, voluntarily, been released. "I've been alone for 3 years," she said. "Not for lack of opportunity, by choice. Because every person who got close to the version of me that was useful to them. The Ashford name, the connections, the orbit. I stopped being able to tell the difference." She looked at me steadily. "You didn't know who I was. For 4 nights you looked at me like I was just a woman on a stool. Do you understand how—" Her voice caught, briefly, precisely. "How long it's been since anyone did that?" I understood. I understood completely, and the understanding of it moved through me with a weight that had nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with recognition. 2 people who had learned to live adjacent to their own lives, finding each other in the specific grammar of a bar and 43 drinks, and an impossible question asked with complete sincerity. I reached out, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold from the night air. She looked down at our joined hands, with an expression I would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately, and never quite managing. The closest I could get was, "arrived." She looked like someone who had been traveling for a very long time, and had just, unexpectedly, arrived. We walked back through the park with our hands held between us, not talking much, not needing to. At the park entrance she stopped and turned to me, and I was certain, that she was going to kiss me. She didn't. She looked at me for a long moment instead, with those steady eyes that had been reading me since the first night, and then she said, "I need to tell you something before this goes further. Something about why I really came to that bar, and I need you to hear it before—" She glanced at our hands. "Before this becomes something neither of us can take back." I felt the hum behind my sternum shift into something sharper. "Okay," I said. "Tell me." She shook her head slowly. "Not tonight," she said. Tonight needs to stay what it was, but soon, before we go any further." I looked at her. The city moved around us, indifferent and eternal. "All right," I said. "Soon." She squeezed my hand once, firm, deliberate, like a promise being made with the body instead of words. And then she let go, and stepped back, and looked at me one final time with that expression I didn't have language for yet. She took a car home, a black sedan that appeared with the quiet efficiency of a life lived at a different scale than mine. Before she got in, she turned back and said, "The bourbon was the right choice. For the last one." "I know," I said. She smiled, fully this time, no almost about it, and got in the car. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights disappear uptown, and I stood there probably a minute longer than was reasonable, and then I walked to the subway with my hands in my pockets, and the feeling, specific and unfamiliar and terrifying in the best possible way, of being completely, dangerously present in my own life. She called 3 days later. Not texted. Called, which felt significant in the way that phone calls feel significant now, in an era when most people treat them as a last resort or a declaration of emergency. I was on my day off, sitting cross-legged on my second-hand couch with a library book I hadn't been reading, and when her name appeared on my screen, I looked at it for 2 full rings before answering, not out of strategy, but because I needed those 2 rings to locate something steady inside myself before I spoke to her. "Hi," I said. "Hi," she said. A pause, not uncomfortable, just full. "Are you free on Saturday?" "I can be," I said. "I need to show you something," she said. "And tell you something." The thing I mentioned. The thing she'd mentioned. The reason. The real one. I'd been sitting with the not knowing of it for 3 days like a stone in my shoe. Not painful exactly, but constantly present, altering the way I moved through everything else. "Okay," I said. "Where?" "My apartment," she said. Then, after a brief pause that felt like she was acknowledging the significance of the offer, "If that's all right." "That's all right," I said. Her apartment was on the Upper East Side, 12 floors up in a building that expressed its exclusivity quietly. No ostentatious lobby. No uniformed doormen performing authority. Just clean lines, good materials, a concierge who greeted her by name with the calibrated warmth of someone well paid to make wealth feel effortless. The elevator was the kind that opened directly into the apartment, which still startled me despite the fact that I'd been mentally preparing for the scale of her life since the Forbes article. The doors opened, and I stepped out into space. Real space. The kind that Manhattan hoards and distributes only to those who can pay for it in quantities that felt almost philosophical. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the park. Bookshelves that covered an entire wall. Floor-to-ceiling. Organized in a system I couldn't immediately decode but wanted to. Art on the walls that was clearly real and clearly chosen with genuine feeling rather than investment logic. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, actually in it, not performing domesticity but genuinely occupied with it, which surprised me. She was making coffee with the focused attention she brought to everything, and she was in jeans and a loose cream sweater, and without the silk blouses and the pearls and the camel coat she looked. I searched for the right word and kept arriving at the same one. Human. Completely, accessibly human. She handed me a cup, and we stood at the kitchen counter for a moment doing the small talk of 2 people who are both aware the small talk is a runway for something larger and are being patient with it out of mutual respect. I told her I liked her bookshelves. She told me they were organized by the emotional register she'd been in when she read each one. I told her that was the most Vivian Ashford system I could imagine. She said, You've known me 2 weeks and you already have a concept of what's most me, I said. I've been paying attention. She looked at her coffee cup. I know, she said softly. That's part of why I need to tell you this. She led me to the sitting room, an understated space that somehow managed to feel lived in despite its size, with a reading chair positioned precisely to catch the afternoon light, and a low table with 3 books on it that were clearly mid-rotation rather than decorative. She sat on the sofa, and I sat beside her, and she held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the park through the windows for a moment, gathering herself. I waited. Outside, Central Park was doing its early April thing, that tentative, hopeful green arriving on the trees, the kind of color that always felt slightly miraculous after a New York winter, like the city had been making a private bet with itself that it could do it again. My father used to come to the Meridian, she said finally. She said it quietly, to the window. In the last 2 years of his life, after his diagnosis, when he needed somewhere to go that wasn't the apartment or the office or anywhere anyone could find him and ask him to be Gerald Ashford instead of just a man having a drink. He'd go alone. He told me about it, just once near the end. He said there was a bartender there who always seemed to know what he needed before he asked, and that sitting at that bar was the only place in the city where he felt completely, she paused, anonymous, safe, like himself. I sat very still. The coffee cup in my hands was warm. The park outside was doing its green, hopeful thing. Something was assembling itself in my understanding slowly, piece by piece, the way a picture comes together in peripheral vision before you look at it directly. Vivian, I said carefully, how long ago did your father pass? 4 years, she said. 4 years and 3 months. I set my cup down on the low table. I started at the Meridian 4 years and 5 months ago, I said. She nodded. She'd known this. Of course she had. She was a woman who planned everything and had looked up every relevant detail before she ever sat down on that corner stool. He described you, she said. Not by name. He didn't know your name. He said... Her voice was even, but only just. He said she has the hands of someone who takes things seriously, and she never makes you feel like your sadness is inconvenient. She turned to look at me then. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible in a way that made my chest ache with a specific tender pain. I thought about Gerald Ashford, whom I had never known by name. I thought about the regulars who came in during those first months of my job at the Meridian. The ones who ordered quietly and sat with their drinks like they were sitting with something else entirely, something heavier and more private than anything you could pour into a glass. I thought about all the people I had learned to read, and how sometimes reading someone meant simply leaving them alone inside their own silence. And I understood. Sitting in that apartment with the park going green outside and Vivian's hands tight around her coffee cup, that she had come to the bar to find something her father had told her was there. Not me, specifically, but the thing I'd apparently given him without knowing it. A place to be a person. The simple, enormous gift of being seen without being known. You came because of him, I said. Yes, she said. At first. I waited. And then I came back because of you, she said. Because you were exactly what he described. And because... She stopped. Breathed. Continued. Because I have spent 4 years trying to grieve a man who was the only person in my family who truly saw me, and I didn't know how to start. And then I found the place he came to feel like himself. And you were there. And you... She looked at me with those stripped open eyes. You made me feel like it was all right to just be a person, the way he felt. And I didn't plan that part. I want you to know I didn't plan that part. I reached over and took her hand, the same way I had in the park, slowly, giving her room, and she held it with both of hers, and we sat in that big, quiet, light-filled room with the park going hopeful and green beyond the glass. And I understood that this was the real origin of us. Not the proposal, not the 43 drinks, not the first night with the water and the $50 bill. It was a man named Gerald Ashford who had sat at my bar 4 years ago and felt briefly like himself. It was grief and inheritance, and a daughter who had carried her father's description of a stranger for years until she was brave enough to go find her. We sat like that for a long time. At some point she said, "Are you angry?" I thought about it genuinely. "No," I said. "I think I'm honored. In a way I don't have the right words for yet." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father would have liked you. Very much." I looked at the park. "I think I would have liked him too," I said. And I meant it as the simple, true thing it was. And she received it that way. And something in her shoulders dropped about an inch, like she'd been carrying that particular hope for a very long time, and had finally been allowed to set it down. I met Margaret Ashford on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Meetings that have the potential to permanently alter the trajectory of your life should happen on more dramatic days. Stormy Fridays, charged Sunday evenings, at least a Wednesday with weather. Instead, it was a clear, unremarkable Tuesday in late April, and I was wearing my second-best jacket and the boots I reserved for occasions that required me to feel grounded, and Vivian had told me over breakfast that morning that her mother had requested lunch and that she'd said yes before she could talk herself out of it. "She knows," Vivian said, looking at her toast. "About us." "How?" "My mother has known everything that happens in this family approximately 48 hours before it happens," she said. "It's her particular gift. I've stopped trying to understand the mechanism." I drank my coffee. "Should I be afraid?" Vivian looked at me seriously. "Yes," she said, "but don't let her see it." The restaurant was in Midtown, the kind of place that didn't need to advertise because its clientele didn't discover restaurants through advertising. Quiet, impeccably lit, the sort of menu that used negative space the way expensive real estate used square footage. Margaret Ashford was already seated when we arrived, which I understood immediately was not coincidence but positioning. She was 71 and looked 60, and carried herself like someone who had decided at approximately age 30 that the normal passage of time was a suggestion she wasn't obligated to follow. She had Vivian's cheekbones and none of Vivian's warmth and eyes that did an assessment of me in the time it took me to cross the room that was so thorough I felt briefly inventoried. She did not stand. She extended her hand across the table. "Ms. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Ashford," I said. I shook her hand firmly. She noted the firmness. I could see her noting it. Lunch began with pleasantries that were not pleasant, the conversational equivalent of two people circling a room, taking measurements. Margaret asked about my background with the gracious efficiency of someone conducting an interview they'd already decided the outcome of. I answered honestly, without apology, without the performative self-deprecation that I suspected she was waiting for and would have used against me. I told her I grew up in Queens, that my mother was a school administrator, that I had a degree in literature from Fordham, that I'd funded with loans I was still paying down, that I'd fallen into bartending after a year in publishing that had taught me I was better with people than manuscripts. She listened to all of this with an expression of perfect, practiced neutrality. Vivian sat beside me and ate her appetizer with the focused calm of someone who had been managing their mother's effect on rooms since childhood, and had developed a very specific kind of stamina for it. "You understand," Margaret said, setting down her fork with a precision that indicated we were moving into the real portion of the conversation, that Vivian's position is not simply personal. She represents something. The Ashford name carries obligations that extend beyond individual choices. "I understand that's how you see it," I said. Vivian's hand found my knee briefly under the table. Not a warning, I thought, but solidarity. Margaret's eyes were steady on mine. "And how do you see it, Ms. Mercer?" "I see a woman," I said, "who has spent a significant portion of her life being seen as a representative of something rather than as a person. And I think that's cost her a great deal." A silence settled over the table. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, with an expression that was unreadable in the way that very intelligent people's expressions are unreadable when they're recalibrating. "You're direct," she said finally. "I find that's more efficient," I said, "than the alternative." Margaret turned to Vivian then, a slow, deliberate turn that felt like a reorientation of the entire conversation. "She's not what I expected," she said, as if I weren't present. It was a test, I understood, to see if I'd react to being spoken about in the third person at a table I was sitting at. I didn't react. I cut a piece of my fish and ate it and found it very good. Vivienne met her mother's eyes evenly. "No," she said. "She isn't what anyone would expect. That's rather the point." Margaret looked back at me. Something had shifted in her assessment, not warmth, not approval, but a subtle upgrade in the category she'd placed me in. From liability, perhaps, to unknown quantity, which, in the context of Margaret Ashford, I suspected was the better place to be. The lunch continued for another hour, and covered topics that ranged from the Ashford Foundation's upcoming gala to a board restructuring that Margaret described in terms designed to remind everyone at the table of the scale of what she managed, and underneath all of it, the real conversation kept happening in the spaces between sentences. A negotiation conducted entirely in subtext, in the length of pauses and the direction of glances, and the particular way Margaret said Vivian's name, which contained, I began to notice, a complicated love that had simply never learned a healthy vocabulary. She loved her daughter. I was almost certain of it. She just loved her in the way that people love things they're also afraid of losing control of, and she'd never been offered a reason to examine the difference. At one point, while Vivian was briefly excused from the table, Margaret leaned forward slightly and said in a lower register, "She hasn't been happy. Not for a long time. I'm aware of my contribution to that." She said it the way someone confesses something they've rehearsed, precisely, without inflection, as if the removal of emotion from the statement made it safer to say. I looked at her steadily. "I know," I said. "I can see it on her." "Can you?" Margaret said, not skeptically, almost hopefully. "Yes," I said, "and I can see it getting better." Margaret sat back. She picked up her wineglass and turned it once and said nothing for a moment. Then, "She came to me last week, told me about you, about Gerald, about why she went to the bar." Her voice caught, almost imperceptibly, on her late husband's name. "She hasn't talked to me about her father in 4 years," she said quietly. "Not once. Not directly." I understood then something important about Margaret Ashford. Something that her public persona, her board authority, her formidable reputation had made invisible. She was a woman who had lost her husband and then lost her daughter to the same grief, and hadn't known how to reach across that loss, and had responded to not knowing by tightening her grip on everything she could still control. It didn't excuse the years of pressure and expectation, and the interview where she described Vivian's personal life as an area of concern, but it made her human, complicated and flawed and human. When Vivian returned to the table, Margaret looked at her daughter with an expression I doubted she knew was visible, and what was in it was not management or assessment or disappointment. What was in it was simply love, asking to be let back in. We left the restaurant at 2:30 into the bright midtown afternoon. Vivian and I walked half a block in silence before she said, Well, I agreed. "She didn't hate you?" she said. "High praise," I said. Vivian laughed, the real one, unguarded. "For Margaret, it genuinely is," she said. I took her hand on the sidewalk, in broad daylight, in the middle of midtown Manhattan, where anyone could see, which was not nothing. She looked down at our joined hands, and then up at me with an expression that was becoming familiar to me now. That arrived look, the one I'd first seen in the park. She squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. The city moved around us exactly as it always did, indifferent and eternal. And we walked uptown together through the Tuesday afternoon sunlight. And I thought about Gerald Ashford coming to my bar to feel like himself, and his daughter finding me because of it, and the strange, specific, unglamorous way that real things begin. That night, alone in my Bronx apartment, I called my mother. I told her I'd met someone. She asked the questions mothers ask, good questions, careful ones. And at the end, she said, "Are you scared?" "Completely," I said. "Good," she said. "That means it's real." I sat with that for a while after we hung up. Then I painted the bedroom wall. The same deep green as the kitchen, making things intentional, starting to stay. The thing about letting someone in, really in, not the managed version of in that I'd been practicing for 3 years, is that it doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in accumulation. It happens in the Tuesday morning she showed up at my apartment with coffee and a bag of groceries, because I'd mentioned offhand the night before that my refrigerator contained approximately nothing, and she stood in my green kitchen and made eggs with the focused attention she brought to everything, and I sat on the counter watching her and thought, this is it. This is the thing I've been standing outside of. It happens in the Saturday afternoon we spent entirely in her apartment reading. She in the chair angled for the light, me on the sofa with my feet tucked under me. 3 hours passing in companionable silence broken only by occasional sentences read aloud, offered like small gifts across the room. It happens in the argument we had in the second week of May about something small that was actually about something large, and the way we both stayed in the room for it instead of retreating, and the way it ended. Not with one of us winning, but with both of us understanding something new about the shape of the other person. The argument was about the gala. The Ashford Foundation held its annual fundraiser in mid-May, a significant event, heavily covered, the kind where photographs ended up in the Times Style section and on the society pages of 3 magazines. Vivian asked me to come. I said yes immediately, which was the honest answer, and then spent 4 days being quietly terrified by it, which was also honest, but which I kept mostly internal until it wasn't. "You're pulling back," she said one evening, watching me from across her kitchen counter with that reading the room expression I'd come to recognize as her version of concern. "I'm not pulling back," I said. "You're standing in my kitchen." "You're here physically," she said. "You've been somewhere else for 4 days." I set down the glass I was holding. The city did its nighttime thing beyond the windows. "I'm afraid," I said, "of walking into a room full of people whose entire context for you is one I don't belong to. I'm afraid of being looked at the way your mother looked at me at lunch, except by 200 people simultaneously, and not having a table between me and it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "I should have asked instead of assumed." We talked about it for 2 hours. Not argued, talked, which felt like a different and better thing. A thing I hadn't done enough of in previous relationships because I'd always reached for exit before conversation. I told her what I was actually afraid of, which was not the gala itself, but what it represented. The first time our world would be public. The first time I'd have to stand next to Vivian Ashford in a room that knew exactly who she was and make some kind of peace with the fact that they were also looking at me. She told me she understood, and I believed her. And she also told me that she was afraid too. Afraid of being seen wanting something, in public, in front of people who had been monitoring her personal life like a weather system for years. "But I'm more afraid of not showing up," she said. "With you, publicly, because hiding things is what I've done for a long time, and I don't want to do it anymore." I looked at her across the kitchen. "Okay," I said. We go," she confirmed, and that was that. Danny helped me find a dress. This is a sentence I never expected to be true, but Danny had, it emerged, an extensive and entirely unself-conscious interest in fashion that he'd never mentioned in 3 years of shared shifts because no one had ever asked. He arrived at my apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee and opinions and a clarity of aesthetic vision that was genuinely impressive. And we went to 3 different consignment shops in Brooklyn before he held up a deep emerald silk dress, floor length, simple, with a structure that was quietly authoritative, and said, "This is the one. This is you walking into that room and not apologizing for being there." I put it on in the fitting room and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. He was right. It was the dress that said, "I belong here because I decided I do." I bought it. He cried slightly. He denied this completely when I mentioned it afterward. The gala was held at a venue in the meatpacking district, a converted warehouse that had been transformed with the kind of money that makes transformation look effortless. All warm light and architectural flowers, and a string quartet playing in the corner with considerably more formality than the jazz band at the Meridian, but with the same fundamental purpose. Vivienne met me at the entrance, which she'd insisted on, not arriving separately, not finding each other inside the room, but meeting at the door and walking in together. She was in midnight blue, understated and devastating, and when she saw me, she stopped moving for a beat that was brief enough that only I caught it, and what was in her expression during that beat was something I folded up and put somewhere permanent inside myself. "You look," she started. "So do you," I said, because we were both people who understood when the adequate word was unavailable and the gesture was enough. We walked in together. I felt the room, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films where all heads turn and conversations stop. It was subtler than that. A shift in attention, a current of awareness, the particular social electricity of a room full of people who have known each other for years, encountering something new in their midst. I kept my shoulders back and my chin level, and I thought about Danny, holding up that emerald dress and saying, "You're not apologizing for being here." And I didn't apologize. Vivienne stayed close, not protective, not managing me, but present in a way that said, "This is who I'm with, and I'm glad about it." She introduced me to people with my full name and without qualifier or explanation, which was its own statement. I shook hands, made conversation, found that the skills that made me good at my job translated adequately to a gala if you squinted at them correctly. Reading people was reading people, regardless of the zip code. Margaret was there, naturally. She found us an hour in, moving through the room with the efficiency of someone conducting a military operation that also happened to involve champagne. She greeted Vivienne, then turned to me, and there was a moment, brief, calibrated, where the room held its breath in the way rooms do when a social decision is being made publicly. Margaret Ashford extended her hand and said, "Ms. Mercer, I'm glad you could come." And the way she said it, not warmly exactly, not with the uncomplicated approval I might have hoped for, but with a genuine and deliberate welcome that I understood cost her something to offer, made me think of the restaurant and her voice catching on her husband's name. I shook her hand. "Thank you for having me," I said. She nodded once, looked briefly at her daughter with that private, poorly hidden expression of complicated love, and moved on. Vivienne's hand found mine for a moment in the space her mother left behind. Later, near the end of the evening, we stood at the edge of the room near a window that overlooked the street below, the city doing its nighttime thing, yellow taxis and pedestrians, and the specific layered glow of a Manhattan evening. Vivienne had a glass of water. I had a glass of wine I was only half drinking. We stood close enough that our arms touched, and the string quartet was playing something slow and romantic, with complete sincerity. And I thought about the first night she'd walked into the Meridian, and I thought she was a rich woman who'd gotten lost on her way to somewhere better. I thought about how wrong I'd been, how she'd been exactly where she meant to be, how the lost one, it turned out, had been me, standing outside the door of my own life, waiting for a reason to go in. "Hey," she said softly, turning to look at me. "Where did you go?" "Nowhere," I said. "I'm right here." And the thing about that, the thing that made it different from every other time I'd said something like it, was that I meant it completely. She kissed me for the first time that night. Not at the gala, after, on the sidewalk outside, in the specific privacy of a city that contains so many people it occasionally grants you invisibility. She kissed me like she'd been thinking about it carefully, and had decided this was the right moment, which was exactly how Vivian did everything. I kissed her back like someone who had finally, after a very long time, come home to something, which was exactly how it felt. 6 months after the night Vivian Ashford walked into the Meridian and ordered still water like a dare, I stood in her apartment on a Sunday morning making coffee while she slept, and I thought about the word home. I'd been thinking about it in pieces for weeks, turning it over quietly the way you turn a stone in your pocket, feeling its edges, its weight, getting used to the fact that you're carrying it. Home had always been a complicated word for me. Growing up in Queens, it meant safety, but also smallness, the particular smallness of a life that loves you, but can't quite imagine you beyond its own borders. In the Bronx apartment, it meant independence, chosen solitude, the green kitchen wall I'd painted, because I needed one intentional thing. In the bar, it meant competence, the satisfaction of a skill practiced well, the community of Danny and Priya, and the regulars who trusted me with their quiet hours. But standing in Vivian's kitchen in the early November light, with the park stripped to its late autumn bones beyond the window, and her coffee machine doing its precise, unhurried work, home meant something new. It meant here, this specific here. This woman still asleep in the next room, who had walked into my bar looking for something her father had described, and found something neither of them had planned. She appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, in a worn gray sweater, that I'd come to think of as my favorite thing she owned because it was the garment most completely removed from the curated public version of her. Her hair was loose and her feet were bare on the hardwood, and she looked at me with the slow, unguarded expression that she only wore in the morning, before the day required anything of her. "You made coffee," she said. "I did," I said. "You figured out the machine," she said with a note of genuine respect, because her coffee machine was an Italian engineering achievement with opinions about the process that had defeated me twice in previous attempts. "Danny sent me a tutorial video," I said. She laughed, the real one, the unpolished one I'd fallen in love with, and came to stand beside me at the counter, and I handed her a cup, and we stood together in the morning light doing nothing in particular, which had become my favorite thing we did. We had settled into each other over those 6 months with a naturalness that still occasionally surprised me. Not because I doubted it, but because I'd spent so long believing that intimacy of this kind was something that happened to other people, people who were more open or more brave or more whatever quality it was I'd decided I was missing. It turned out the quality wasn't missing. It had just been waiting for someone worth the risk of using it. Vivian and I moved between her apartment and my Bronx studio, with the relaxed fluidity of two people who had decided that neither space was the right space, and both spaces were fine for now, that the question of where they lived was less urgent than the question of who they were becoming together. I was still at the Meridian. She was still at Ashford Media. We had dinner together 4 nights a week, and spent the other 3 in that specific comfortable proximity of two people who trust each other enough to be separate. Margaret had called me in September. Not Vivian. Me, directly, on my cell phone, which meant she'd gotten the number from her daughter, and her daughter had let her have it, which was its own quiet statement. She asked if I would meet her for coffee, just the two of us. I said yes, and we met at a place on the east side that was clearly her regular, where the staff knew her order, and she sat with the ease of someone on familiar ground, and she talked to me for 2 hours in a register I hadn't heard from her at the gala, or the lunch. Something lower, less armored, more simply human. She talked about Gerald, about the marriage that had been real and complicated and full of love, expressed mostly through the wrong channels, about the years since his death, when she'd poured everything into the company, because the company was something she could hold, and the grief was something she couldn't. She talked about Vivian with a kind of helpless, confessional honesty. that I understood was not easy for her, and that I received carefully and without judgment. At the end of it, she looked at me across the table and said, "Take care of her. Not the way people take care of things they're afraid to lose. The way people take care of things they trust to stay." I held that for a moment. "I will," I said. "If she'll let me." Margaret almost smiled. "She's letting you," she said. "That's the whole story." The proposal, the real one, the one that came after the original impossible question and its reckless, life-altering answer, happened on a Sunday in late October. We were in Riverside Park, the same park we'd walked through the night after the 43 drinks, and the trees were doing their full autumn performance, amber and rust and gold against a sky that was the particular sharp blue of New York in October, a color that always felt like an argument against cynicism. We were walking with no particular destination, the way we'd learned to walk together, comfortable in the directionlessness of it, and Vivian stopped on the same path where I'd first taken her hand in the dark. She stopped and turned and looked at me with that expression, the arrived one, the one I'd loved since the park, the one that meant she was fully, unhurriedly present. And she said, "I have a question." "Okay," I said. My heart was doing something loud and specific in my chest. "A different one this time," she said. "You don't have to drink anything." "Thank God," I said. She laughed. Then she reached into the pocket of the camel coat, still the camel coat, always the camel coat, and brought out a ring that was simple and perfect, and entirely her, a thin band with a single stone that caught the October light and held it. She held it between us without going down on one knee, because Vivian Ashford did things her own way, always, and looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Sloane Mercer, will you marry me? Because you want to. Not because I drank 43 drinks, although I remain very proud of that." I was laughing, and something else simultaneously, something that had no name except the feeling of all the doors inside you opening at once. "Yes," I said. "Obviously, yes." She put the ring on my finger with steady hands, and then pulled me into her and held on. And I held back, and the park did its amber and gold thing around us, and the city did its eternal, indifferent thing beyond the tree line, and none of it touched us because we were entirely, completely, sufficiently inside our own moment. We told Danny first. He cried and didn't deny it. We told Priya, who said she'd known since the night Vivian drank the Islay scotch that this was inevitable. We told my mother, who said, "Bring her to Queens. I want to feed her." We told Margaret over dinner at the apartment. Vivian's apartment, which was beginning to feel like our apartment in the way that things become yours through use and love, and the slow accumulation of two people's objects on the same shelves. Margaret looked at the ring on my finger, and then at her daughter, and said nothing for a moment that was long enough to hold everything it needed to hold. And then she reached across the table and covered Vivian's hand with hers in a gesture that was, for Margaret, the equivalent of a declaration. Vivian looked at her mother's hand over hers with an expression that broke something open in me, quietly and gently. They were finding their way back to each other. It was slow and imperfect and real, and it was happening. I still work at the Meridian. I've thought about what comes next. There are ideas forming, slow and unrushed, about what I might want to build, though I'm in no hurry. The bar has given me too much to leave carelessly, and besides, Danny would be inconsolable. Vivian and I are looking at apartments, a third space, ours from the beginning, with enough bookshelves for her system and a kitchen wall. I'll paint something intentional the first week. We disagree about neighborhoods with the productive energy of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's reasoning. We have learned to argue and to stay, and to come back to each other afterward with something better than we left with. We have learned, both of us, how to be present in our own lives without bracing for the exit. On the night of the 43 drinks, when Vivian set down that last glass of bourbon and looked at me across the bar with bright eyes and said "so," I didn't know any of this was coming. I didn't know about Gerald, or the park, or the emerald dress, or October in Riverside Park with a ring catching the light between us. I only knew that a woman had asked me an impossible question with complete sincerity, and that something in me had recognized the sincerity before it recognized anything else, and had answered it honestly, and that honesty had led, step by careful step, to here, to this Sunday morning in her kitchen, to coffee figured out at last, to bare feet on hardwood, to the specific, ordinary, extraordinary miracle of being completely at home in your own life. Some things begin with grand gestures and become quiet. Ours began with a quiet gesture, a woman ordering water in a room full of noise, and became the grandest thing I have ever been part of. I used to stand just outside the door of my own life. I don't anymore. I walked in, and she was already there, waiting, in the particular way of someone who had planned everything except the most important part, and had found, in that unplanned space, exactly what she needed.